This is the Energy Makers Show, featuring the innovators, financiers, and policymakers focused on the global energy demand. Brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And here's your host, Paul Dickerson.
Hi, I'm Paul Dickerson, and welcome to another episode of the Energy Makers Show. Today we discuss shale, oil and gas development with Mark Brooker, CEO and president of the Frontline Group, one of those companies helping develop projects in the upstream oil and gas space. Then once again, we visit with Laura Capper, CEO, founder of Cap Resources, giving her perspective on helping some of these new energy projects get some traction and get some scale. All that right after this.
Where will the energy come from to move us forward? From natural sources in abundant supply, or perhaps a man-made source? At NRG, we believe innovation will solve our energy needs. That's why NRG is moving away from fossil fuels towards wind, solar, and other sustainable technologies to power the smart grid, the electric car, and our clean energy future. We're using all of our energy to develop more of it.
This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Paul Dickerson.
Welcome back to the Energy Makers Show. My guest now, Mark Brooker, CEO and president of the Frontline Group. Mark, welcome to the program.
Hey, Paul. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Now, tell me a little bit. Frontline Group's involved with many things, and I'd love to narrow down its focus.
Well, let's narrow down around upstream oil and gas, because helping people develop projects in upstream oil and gas is one of the primary focuses of our company.
Well, and you've got a fair amount of background there,
That's true.
Right?
That's true. I started in the late 70s. I worked for Western Company, which was a cementing organization. Started on the back of a truck, worked my way up through drilling rigs, and in the early 90s started what became Frontline Group, which supplies project management and technical management resources to upstream oil and gas.
Well, you certainly understand traditional and non-traditional plays.
We've been involved in both. I've been involved with fracking since the beginning of my career, which is a key element to what's going on today.
Well, and let's look a little bit at shale. Can you explain to our viewers a little bit of the shale plays, conventional, unconventional?
Sure, I'd be glad to. To understand shale plays, you need to understand how oil and gas how it came about. Originally, there were mud layers. This was, hundreds of thousands of years ago. There were mud layers or bogs that small animals, very small animals, microbials, and small fauna existed in. And as layers grew on top of that and that stuff deteriorated, that's what became oil and gas as we know it. Imagine chocolate pudding. That's kind of what these layers look like, chocolate pudding. Over time, the oil and gas would leak out of those layers and up into shallower layers and would find its way into reservoirs. Now, what does that mean? Well, there would be a structural element that would trap that, would cause a place to trap that oil and gas into a little pool.
Right.
And historically, that's what we've drilled. We've drilled vertical wells into these traps and released oil and gas. And so the last 100 years of oil and gas development in this country had to do with finding where it would be trapping mechanisms below the surface and drilling into them and capturing that reservoir of oil and gas that had leaked out of what we call source rock, this chocolate pudding.
Right.
The chocolate pudding, if you can imagine that, has very tiny little air holes, as you see in chocolate pudding, and oil and gas was in those, but nothing was connected. These reservoirs, much more like cake.
Right.
So you could pour water or milk through cake and it would flow through there, and that's the way the oil and gas comes out of a conventional reservoir. Yep. You poke a hole into it, and everything moves towards that hole.
Right.
In the shales, what we found out was that if we could come up with a way of connecting all those small holes in this pudding, then we had quite a bit of oil and gas to recover. In fact, much, much more that's been recovered. Now, we're looking at a map here that shows shale reservoirs across the United States, and of course, they're sitting below historical oil fields in the United States. So we're not talking about entering a lot of new places in the U.S. We're talking about going back into old oil fields now and drilling up the source rocks in those.
So why is it that these shales are available to us now where they weren't even 20, 30 years ago?
Well, there's two technologies.
Okay.
The first is horizontal drilling, which is the ability to drill not vertically into the reservoir, but now horizontally down through the reservoir, which allows us to connect all of those little chocolate pudding spaces we were just talking about.
And what's the other one?
And the other one is going to be multi-stage fracking, which allows us to pick exactly the spots along that wellbore that we want to frack. So imagine if that wellbore was a broomstick and we started to slide donuts on that, we can now individually frack each one of those donuts around that wellbore and open it up.
The controversy around fracking, is it real, not real?
People in the industry, and I agree with them, don't think that it's real because we're 10,000 feet below the surface here. The chances of frac fluid leaching up, especially beyond the old reservoirs into those sealed mechanisms, is very remote. The only potential for this is coming up the wellbore, and with good cementing practices, you're not going to have that. So the chances of this leaking into local freshwater aquifers is almost nil.
All right, now you showed us the map of North America
Sure.
with these shale plays. We'll hear from some commenters that it's not real, some that it is. How do you reconcile
Well, here's the
that?
part that doesn't make sense about those kind of comments. Remember, I talked about the conventional reservoirs, and we've pulled billions of barrels of oil and gas out of those.
Right.
And those represented only a small percentage of what was actually generated down below and leaked up into those reservoirs.
Right.
So we're talking about entering the generational source rock here. There's going to be billions and billions more barrels to be found, and because these technologies not only unlock it, but unlock very specific segments of it, there's a whole lot greater recovery that we have opportunity for than we've ever had in the past.
Such a great explainer. So what? No, absolutely. And what is Frontline Group's role within that space?
Well, here's an interesting thing. Remember, I just said there were a lot of wells to be drilled in
Sure.
here. The original conventional well would drain everything it possibly could here. In these, you only drain about the size of the donuts.
Right.
So you have to put a number of these side by side. Well, one of the things that we help companies do is figure out what are their standardized processes so that they can do wellbore after wellbore after wellbore and have similar outcomes. We help them bring process improvement into play so that as they learn techniques, they keep duplicating those techniques properly. The other big issue is a lot of people in the oil and gas business today look a lot like me. They have gray hair. So they're all retiring, and we're bringing in a new group of people. So what we do is help this new group of people get process transferred to them of how to do this, and that can be in training, that can be in a process structure of the plan of how they do this, so that not only do they learn what they're learning currently and apply that to improving each one of these plans, but additionally, we're trying to get the experience of all the guys like me that are beginning to retire out of the business transferred to them as well, so they don't have to relearn many of the things that we learned.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming
You bet.
in today.
Thank you.
And that concludes our discussion with Mark Brooker. We'll be right back with more right after this.
The future is here.
You can't see it. It's electric.
At NRG, we're providing clean energy and now charging stations to make the electric car a reality. Kinda makes you want a boogie woogie, doesn't it? NRG, moving clean energy forward.
It's electric.
This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Paul Dickerson.
Welcome back to the Energy Makers Show. Our guest once again is Laura Capper, founder and CEO of CAP Resources. Great to see you.
Paul, thank you so much. Great to be here.
Now, lately we've talked to a lot of innovators, a lot of CEOs who are trying to make their dreams into a reality. And as you know, that path to scale, that path to commercialization can be a tough one.
It can.
Now, you've helped many people down that road. What advice do you offer CEOs trying to scale?
Well, that's the kind of central part of our business is helping companies kind of launch these new technologies. So topic close to home. Probably my first advice would be very defensive, is get yourself a good IP attorney. It's a very competitive industry, and if you've got a solid idea, frankly, the first thing you want to do is make sure it's protected. And they can tell you there's a lot of ways to go about that. There's filing patents, filing provisional patents that might be a little less expensive and give you a foot in the door kind of. But that's pretty important before you start talking to potential customers or partners, is to have your idea protected with a patent. So I'd start there.
As you go through your checklists for these CEOs, what's next?
Well, a big question, of course, is does it work? And this is probably the biggest issue. Somebody starting out either in alternative energy or conventional oil and gas is showing that your product works. And one of the things I've learned over the last 3 or 4 years is showing something works in the lab is nothing like showing something works in the field.
Sure.
It's almost like a war operation that you don't have control of things in the field. You've got weather and logistics problems and all these real world problems, and you just don't see those in a lab. So we've seen a lot of people get really pumped up on lab results, and most operators or oilfield service companies or venture capitalists, they don't get kind of all pumped up until they've seen it work in the field. And in our industry, we call that the chasm. You can get somebody to try it out in the lab, but getting somebody to try it out in the field or put it down their well, that's the chasm. So you need friends to get those field tests. And if you're successful there, that's a huge milestone that can escalate your value considerably.
Now, Laura, tell me about your perspectives on risk. And I mean, do you ever see one of these startups just instantly succeed?
Usually the road is littered with failures, right? It's kind of a realistic part of oil and gas industry is it does take a long time to adapt new technologies. So rotary steerable technologies, I know some of the earliest investors in that sector, and you hear about the home run, you don't hear about the 15 years and 15 million that went into developing it.
And again, maybe for our viewers, define that a bit.
Sure. In oil and gas drilling, for years and years and years, you generally kind of drilled a straight well, or you might be able to deviate it slightly to hit your target. And it was a real breakthrough when they came out with technologies that would truly let you control the path of the well bore. So you're spinning the bit the whole time, spinning this massive thing going, thousands of feet, and trying to keep it on track. So mud motors were kind of an early step in that direction. And then with a lot of the offshore activity, rotary steerable tools are what let operators take an offshore platform that could be in thousands of feet in water and maybe drill 20 wells from that, because you can curve them all essentially and hit different targets all from one platform. So that was a technology that had huge impact. Certainly fracturing was the technology that allowed us to, recoup the benefits of all these shale plays. There's a lot of interesting stuff on the material science and chemistry side. If you can come up with a green, environmentally friendly way of killing bacteria as opposed to using chemicals, that's an area that a lot of people are very actively interested in these days. So ton of neat stuff out there. It just takes a while to get adopted by industry. In general, we're kind of a risk-adverse industry. We want to make sure it works before we put it down our own well.
Many of these large incumbents have a venture arm, where many of these startups are incubated or at least early financed. What's your experience been in working with some of those venture arms and companies involved with?
Oh, we've actually they've been great customers for us. So of course I love my customers.
Yes,
It's a nice mechanism for the companies that run those groups. Right. I'll put in a plug for Chevron's group as an example. So what they want to invest in is technologies that are strategic to the company.
Right.
So the nice thing is they have access to that company. So, that chasm, trying to get technology in the field, well, if you've got a venture arm of a company, they can help you get it into a field.
Yeah.
So that provides a lot of value. And then, like anybody else, they want to see a nice return, so they'll look for other markets beyond that. But in fact, we've had kind of a decline in that. A lot of companies aren't maintaining their own venture group. And
why is that, do you think?
I think it's just a different business model for them. They're used to the risks of developing oil and gas. Many are not used to an entirely different set of risks associated with new technologies or material science. So it's just kind of, do we kind of have the stomach? Do we have the long-term vision that we're going to invest in stuff that might not pan out for 10 or 15 years? Ultimately, those guys are probably going to be the winners, the ones that do take the risk, but you've got to have the stomach to do that. So it kind of ebbs and flows. Given company might have a great venture group for 10 years, and then you don't hear much, and then they pop back up and get back to work again. So. But in general, it's a very necessary mechanism in our industry, I think, because it gets people over that chasm.
How else are you working with the startups? Are you helping fill out the management teams, helping educate them to move forward? Tell us a little bit.
Our general strategy is usually they come to us with some invention, some core invention, and they sincerely believe it will solve the world's problems.
Sure.
You may have heard that a time or two before. And what we've learned is that you really, really, really have to focus. You're not going to solve the world's problems. You're a little teeny company. You have no resources or assets. Solve one problem really well. Yeah. So the question is, what's that one problem? So probably the first thing we help them do is really understand the market landscape and get them to focus in the one area that they provide the most value.
Right.
And then once you get proven out there, you can expand from there. But that's probably the biggest challenge, and I think that applies to almost any industry.
Wow. Great to have you on the show.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you
Pleasure,
as always. And that wraps this week's episode of The Energy Makers Show, heard on the radio nationwide and seen right here at TheEnergyMakers.com. I'm Paul Dickerson, and we'll see you next week.